Hello and welcome to this week's conversation with the Middle East Monitor. My name is Nassim Ahmed and I will be hosting today's discussion. Many of the readers of MEMO will have seen over the past 15 months, how we've just been heartbroken seeing the images of children maimed, killed and injured in Gaza. So far, nearly 18,000 children have been killed according to conservative estimates. And in this conversation, we are taking a deeper look at the impact the military aggression is having on children in Gaza. And I want to do this on the back of a report that was released last month by War Child. It's first of a study in the psychological impact of war on vulnerable children in Gaza. Joining me to discuss the report and also his own experience having just returned from Gaza is Kieran King. He is the head of humanitarian at War Child. Kieran, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
As I mentioned, I mean, we've been watching some of the shocking scenes over the past 15 months. You've just returned from Gaza, and the report your organization has published is focused on children, which we'll get to in detail. But before we do, I was wondering if you just want to share some of your thoughts, having visited Gaza and come back recently. You've lived there for a while, you mentioned as well. What are your thoughts having come back from Gaza recently?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, a lot of thoughts, a lot of feelings as well. Like you mentioned, I'd lived in Gaza previously with another organization, and I left in 2022. And at that point in time, we were already talking about Gaza as a crisis, right? And a mental health crisis, as well as a crisis that takes many other forms as well. And there had been studies done in the past as well about the impact of the blockade on Gaza, on children in particular, and the psychological impact of that. So it was difficult going back, just from a personal perspective, I guess, as well, and meeting old colleagues and friends of mine on the ground and seeing how much has changed in them. So not just the actual physical landscape. I think the first thing that you notice going to Gaza is that all of the destruction that you see on the kind of different news articles and on TV is not just a snapshot of pointing a camera in a particular direction. It's everywhere. When you first cross, the only crossing that's open at the moment to humanitarian aid workers, Korean Shalom. The second you cross, you're just surrounded with flattened buildings, rubble, pepper-shotted buildings from previous battles. And the population of Gaza is still there, like living in amongst the rubble. So I think just the physical scene is truly shocking and unlike something I've ever seen before. I've worked in a number of different conflict zones over the last 15 years, and this is by far the worst I've seen, just in terms of the physical destruction. So that was the first really impact that I noticed. And then as soon as you start talking to people in Gaza, you start to get a sense of where people in Gaza are and where they are in terms of the stage of the crisis, I guess. And one of the real reflections, which we can talk more about because it's very relevant to the report that we're going to discuss as well, is the normalization of the violence and how the people in Gaza have become used to this. And we've seen that. I can give you anecdotes later on as well when we get to it, of examples of conversations I had with caregivers, with children, with our staff, talking about their own families as well, and what I've physically observed as well, where people are just used to the violence in their own way. And when the drones overhead, you can hear the kind of sound of the drones constantly in Gaza. People no longer look up. When the fast air comes in and drops bombs, people don't flinch. So I think that normalization was a surprise to me. There's a constant level of fear. There's a constant level of hopelessness, and some of that's captured in the report as well that was published in December. But it was a surprise to me to see how widespread that kind of sense of hopelessness was. And I think just the humanitarian system that's trying to mitigate the impact of what's going on as well, seeing how much that is struggling to keep up, not just with the needs, but also the obstructions and limitations when it comes to access of aid as well, access of movement. So yeah, I mean, I can give you a lot more as we get into the conversation.
Before we go into some of the horrific details that's documented by the report, I mean, how were you able to compile the report itself? Because as we know, it's Gaza's a war zone. Many would say, there's a genocide going on, and we see the devastation. How were the Palestinians? How did they receive you when you went in saying we are conducting a report for War Child and we want to document the impact it's having on children? I mean, it's taking part in a survey or report seems like the last thing on their mind, given the challenges they face. So how was it that you were able to question the many hundreds of people that you were able to question and compile this data, and how were they receptive towards you?
Well, it's important to note, first of all, that the data itself was collected by one of our partner organizations, the Community Training Center for Crisis Management, which is a long-standing organization in Gaza. So we've been supporting them, working with them on the ground, not just since October the 7th, but for many years before. War Child's worked in Gaza since 2009 and responded to the many other wars that have taken place since then. It's a really good question, right? And we see that not just in terms of gathering evidence and gathering data, but also in terms of programs. So what programs are relevant and how those are received as well. I can get into a bit more detail on that, particularly when we talk about addressing mental health as a unique crisis in Gaza compared to other conflicts, which often is not at the top of people's priority lists when they don't have food, they don't have clean water, they don't have access to hygiene and dignity. But the data itself, what I did notice, I wasn't involved in the physical data collection, but had a lot of engagement with our partner and with our staff on the ground. And as you said, I just left Gaza in December, just before Christmas. And the majority of people that I spoke to are desperate to talk about what's happening to them, right? Mm-hmm. So yes, there are expectations on humanitarian organizations in terms of aid provision and growing frustration as well, and an increasing loss of acceptance of the humanitarian system being unable to provide what people need. But as soon as you start getting into conversations around people's stories and the impact the horrific situation they find themselves in is having on them, people are really willing and eager to talk, to speak, and tell their story. I think people, I can't speak for Palestinians in Gaza, but what I noted talking to people and reflections that were shared with me, particularly from our staff, but also partners and recipients or participants of the aid that we're supporting with, wanted to tell us their story, and also at the same time have very few opportunities with which to do so. They feel abandoned, they feel lost, they feel like the international community's forgotten what's happening in Gaza. Every red line has been crossed. It's not clear what red lines are left. So that's the short answer. I think gathering data is not particularly difficult because people are willing to speak and contribute. But it is important that we also then managing expectations when gathering data, such as what was gathered for this study, that we are also being clear on managing expectations, what we are providing, what we can provide, and what we can't provide as well.
You mentioned red lines. Do Palestinians feel that they've been abandoned? Of course, people like you are on the ground, and a number of other organizations are on the ground. And we've seen a video of Palestinians in Gaza, rightly so, saying, why are you recording this? No one's going to pay any attention to our suffering and the war of annihilation that's been launched against the Palestinians. How deep is that sentiment? Do you think Palestinians do feel as though they've been abandoned from your conversation interactions with the people there?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I can't. I want to be careful not to speak for Palestinians, but I can talk about the
Mm,
conversations I had and what was told to me, right? And for sure, I can say that every conversation along those lines that I had with anyone in Gaza, whether it was Palestinian staff working with our partner organizations or for War Child ourselves, and also caregivers, particularly in communities who I sat down and spoke to. Yes, is the short answer. They do feel abandoned, the ones that I spoke to, at least. I can't speak in general terms on that point. I think there was a much more of an expectation that particularly the international community, particularly Western governments, would do a lot more to preserve the rights, particularly of children in Gaza. And as we see rights violations being infringed repeatedly, day on day, week on week, with increasing severity as well, increasing severity of violations. The conversations I've had with people, I can summarize as there being a kind of a tone of disbelief and also, frankly, a tone of resignation as well. So there is still, I would say, like a semblance of hope that something will change, and people are desperate for anything to change. The people I spoke to there, and again, I don't want to speak on general terms, but they're no longer interested in the politics. They're no longer interested in who's doing what or what's right and what's wrong. They're interested in this stopping. And that was the consistent message. If I can give one example, there was one moment where I was stood on our rooftop and of our office, and our office is right in the middle of a large displacement camp in the middle area of Gaza within the humanitarian zone. So we're surrounded by, in our immediate vicinity, around 100,000 people living in tents. And this was about 9 p.m. at night, and heard this slowly rising chorus of kind of cheers. And that slowly grew into this elation and people celebrating in the streets, flashing torches and cheering. And within about 5 minutes, that slowly started to ebb away. And I was at the time calling a few people saying, what's going on? What's happened? Like, you sort of assume there's been some sort of truce or something, some news. And what happened is there had been a photo of an EU delegate at the Rafah crossing. That's the crossing between Gaza and Egypt, which has been closed since May. Just that photo circulating on the Signal messaging app was enough to stir a rumor that something was changing, and that either Rafah was going to be opened or that was a signal of a truce. And that was enough for a rumor to spread and hope to come alive, even just for 5 minutes. And then, of course, incredibly depressing to see that excitement, that elation slowly ebb away when people realize that that was not the case and things are not changing today. So I can't quite remember the question you asked me, and I'm on a bit of a tangent.
No,
But I think
I mean, it's fine. I mean, the anecdote was really, really useful. I think you made the point about there is a sense of resignation, but of course there is also pockets of hope there. And it's no for no reason why Palestinians describe sumud, which is resistance or being able to withstand suffering, as being one of their key attributes. And you see that even in Gaza. I mean, amidst all the horror and tragedy, there are Palestinians who remain resilient and steadfast. And this is what sumud means. And this is what Palestinians, this is how they describe their struggle, that, no matter what, we will get back up. No matter what, we'll get back up. And they've done that for over 100 years. And that's a key characteristics. And also the issue about the fact that there is a sense of resignation. I think it's not just the Palestinians. I think here in the West as well, ourselves, I think we are also shocked by the level of, shall I say, complicity and turning a blind eye. Not only that, in the case of the US, supporting this all the way through, I don't think any of us would have expected this level of support and complicity to the horror that we're seeing in Gaza. So I think that's, it surprised us as well. It shocked us as well.
Sure.
I mean, what I want to ask you next is, I mean, population in Gaza, there is a unique composition of the population. Nearly half are children, and the report itself looks at children. And so, comparing to other conflicts around the world, what makes this more unique and more specific? And what are the unique challenges because of Gaza having a population composition where nearly half are children?
Yeah, I think it's unique in a few ways. Unique in terms of the context, and then also unique in terms of the emergency response as well, so the humanitarian response, but I think, and the operating environment. But if I focus first on what's unique for people living in conflict in Gaza compared to other conflicts, and I don't want to draw too many direct parallels to other conflicts, suggesting life is easier in one than another. But what's undeniable is that this is the first conflict, the only conflict, I think, in living memory, where trauma is being experienced at a population level. That's unique, you know. I think there was a study recently by the Lancet, I believe, and I don't want to quote it directly because I'll need to check the figures, but I know the figure was in there of 22% is the expected, if you take all conflicts kind of on average, 22% of people living in conflict would expect to suffer some form of trauma directly related to that conflict. In Gaza, you can argue that is close to 100%, particularly among children. And the report that we're discussing evidences that as well, where we know that over at least 4/5 of the children who were interviewed and the caregivers who were interviewed for this study demonstrated acute signs of trauma, you know, which takes various different forms. I saw it as well. I can speak from my personal experience. Every child I spoke to and sat down with and observed in our programs was exhibiting signs of trauma, undeniably, whether that's withdrawal, whether it's aggression, and then beyond that, what caregivers report about their children, you know, whether that's nightmares, bedwetting, etc. And I think it's important to mention as well that this didn't start on October the 7th, right? We're talking about 18 years of blockade leading up to this moment. And there have been studies done, I think I mentioned it during the intro, there was one called Trapped, produced by Save the Children in 2022, which also looked at, in 2022, what were the indications of psychological distress among children in Gaza. And that, even then, was highlighting shocking figures. You know, I think the 79%, I believe, was the figure of children exhibiting bedwetting, for example. 59%, I believe, was the figure experiencing signs of reactive mutism. So either not talking or having trouble communicating as a result of a traumatic event. That was before October the 7th. So you can only imagine where we are now. Yeah. So I think that the density of the mental health crisis is one thing that really is unique in Gaza. The inability for people to flee, to escape the violence, and as such, the repeat trauma through repeated displacements, repeated death and injury. Those things are unique. And then the last thing I'll say on that, what's unique, I would say, is the actual aid operation itself. There's never been, as far as I can recall and discussing with colleagues and friends in other organizations, we can't remember a conflict where the aid operation existed on the battlefield. You know, so normally, yes, you'd be responding on the front lines or close to the front lines and supporting people who are sort of remaining in place with the conflict around them. But your office is back in the other town. Your warehouse is back in the capital. The whole aid operation is on the ground in the battle. That's very unique as well, and really inhibits what we're able to do to respond to what our unique needs.
So, Kieran, I want to get back to the impact of being displaced several times over and over again, what that does to a population, especially a child. We'll get back to that. But there are a couple of stats which I wanted to throw at you from the report itself and just get your thoughts on it. For example, 96% of children feel death is imminent. I mean, that was a shocking stat which I read from the report. 49% wish to die, and 87% display severe fear. I mean, from what you saw, can you just speak about how that takes shape in the child and in Gaza, what kind of impact that's having? I mean, even in the UK, I mean, I've spoken to, growing up, a number of kids who are suffering from knife trauma, being in gangs, for example, and constantly living with the idea that someone's going to kill you or stab you or come after you. That's so debilitating. I've seen it firsthand, growing up in East London. And to think that, you know, hundreds of thousands of children are fearing that there's going to be a bomb dropped on their head, the trauma
Yeah,
this must have on them, that's infinitely worse than anything we can ever feel being part of a gang here in the UK, or
yeah,
someone who knows there's a group of drug dealers who's going to come and stab him or kill him, because
yeah.
that also has a draining effect and debilitating effect. So just speak to what kind of impact that's having on children, knowing that 96% fearing death. I mean, that's a shocking stat.
It is shocking, isn't it? I mean, and I share the disbelief. I also grew up in Hackney, and I remember, we would experience it in moments, where maybe it's going home from school, kind of in
Yeah,
winter, and it's dark, and got to walk past a group of guys on the corner, and you feel that fear. And then you get home and it's okay, whereas living with that, I meant, if I can try and paint a picture for what the scene is in Gaza, I guess, and where the threats are coming from for a child. The first I mentioned is the drones. So you've got drones flying overhead, the constant whirring. These are not small, handheld drones. These are big drones, and the sound is deafening, and it's constant all around. That's coupled with fast air, like jets flying overhead. Every morning I would wake up to hear this morning chorus of thud, 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 thud of bombs being dropped, missiles landing. The news, waking up each morning to the news of what's been hit the night before. And that was just what I was experiencing in Gaza. So whatever I was experiencing, children were experiencing too. Plus the knowledge, unlike I knew I could leave. I knew when I was leaving Gaza. For children in Gaza, they have no idea when they can leave. So there's no end point, there's no target that they just need to hold on and get to. This is life. This is now normal. And I really think as an international community, we cannot allow what's happening in Gaza to feel normal, because it's already starting to feel normal to me, in terms of we've had 15 months of news on this. So I think that's one thing, is the physical environment they're living in is not safe. And I was in the humanitarian zone for the majority of the time that I was there, and there were bombs landing in our within 100 meters of our compound. So there is no safe space in Gaza. You can't allow an illusion to be kind of perpetuated that there are safe spaces in Gaza, places for people to move to. If there's an evacuation order, they can move somewhere safe. They can move somewhere reported to be safe, in inverted commas, and the next morning a missile lands on a tent, next door. That's the reality. The other that's only the physical security risk, right? In terms of the fear that we're talking about among children, that's contributing to this 96% of children reporting death, feeling imminent. It's the economic challenges as well. No one knows where their next meal is coming from. People are scraping together whatever fuel they can in order to just light a fire and heat up whatever they've managed to get from the market. I think the vast majority, I think I saw a figure of 86%, that feels low. 86% of families have lost their income, have no income. That's coupled with the lack of cash, lack of access for commercial goods, let alone humanitarian goods, which means what's in the market now is unaffordable. There's very little in the market. You drive along and you drive through the markets in Gaza. I was in a town called Deir Balah, where I was based in the middle area. You drive through the central market there, and there's a few tins, maybe a tin of a few tins of sweet corn, maybe a few bags of maybe flour, if flour is available, which is very rare. And what is there is unaffordable to families. So you can imagine being a child in a household, not knowing where your next meal is coming from, and often having to skip meals. And that evening, we weren't able to get anything, so there is no food. So that level of just survival uncertainty, not withstanding the security risk, but just in terms of meeting your own basic needs, that I think would have a huge impact.
So if you're not, if the bombs don't kill you, then you'll drown in poverty, or the famine
Yeah.
will kill you, or the disease. Despite that, I mean, the report does bring out um, stats about children who have now become breadwinners in the family, and they are they are taking on responsibilities which their fathers would have taken on, and there was a focus on that. How much of that is going on? Of course, that's enforced on them because many of their parents would have been killed, and many are orphans. So you'll have a huge population in Gaza after all this is finished of Palestinian children growing up without parents. And even now, the report, as I said, covers a large section of Palestinians who don't have any breadwinners, and 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds are now the breadwinner and having to survive in this war-stricken, poverty-stricken region in famine. So, I know, did you meet people like that, and what kind of um, what can you say about them, the people who are in that kind of category?
Yeah, I didn't meet any of those, but we know they're there for sure. You know,
Mm.
they were part of this study, and so I can't speak to any personal experiences or comments that was made to me by any of those children who are heading households. I believe the report said it's around 25%, if not
Yes,
20%,
that's right. Yeah.
of households led by children up to the age of 16, so under the age of 17. You can imagine the pressure on those children who are not just responsible for themselves, but responsible for their siblings, potentially parents who are injured or unable to support the family. So the children are having to step up and find ways of either bringing in an income, or more likely being the ones to go out and receive whatever aid is being distributed at various distribution points, when those are infrequently happening. So I don't know. I can't speak to that other than my
Can
personal.
you just address? I mean, the report says there is some economic transaction taking place. Palestinians are living on something like $3 a day. What kind of economic activity is there that you saw? I mean, I'm
Yeah.
assuming people are living on donations and aid. Is there any economic activity, even if a Palestinian child is willing to find a job or do something, some kind of find food for his family? What can they do? I mean, is there any? Did you see anything like that? Is there an
I saw
economy there?
some, yeah, like what you could call the very basic bare bones of a market-based economy. You know, so I mentioned walking through or driving through a market and seeing a few bits of washing powder, maybe a tin of sweet corn or something, and yeah, that's pretty much all you see on the market stalls as you go through. So, but those market stalls still exist, and people are finding ways of also gathering scrap material is one kind of economic activity that I saw. Something devastating to witness is if you wherever you go in Gaza, you will see either rubble, or you'll see tents, or you'll see garbage, and the garbage problem is immense and not really discussed. You know, mountains and mountains of cumulative rubbish, and what you'll see in every one of those mountains of rubbish is children scrambling around in that rubbish. I'm cautious talking about this because I think the optics and the perceptions are wrong. You know, it doesn't do much to contribute to the sense of dignity that should be attached to every child. But the reality for those children are that they're the ones who are having to be out there to gather up whatever plastic they can find that's been discarded, bits of metal that's found its way into rubbish. And they're able to then sell those to whatever traders are kind of smelting that metal to produce whatever. There's one micro example, I guess. There is some very basic low-level trade in commercial goods and food. Very few commercial trucks get across and manage to put those goods to the local market. But immense demand against a meager supply means the cost of goods is unaffordable. I think I mentioned this just before, but to give you an example, the price today of an egg, one egg, not a pack of six, one egg in Gaza is $6. The price of 100 grams of sugar is around $200. It's absurd. So I'll be quite honest.
If you have to live on $3 a day, £3 a day, that's
$3 a day. What can you do? Yeah, exactly. So this is why it's very true that the vast majority of Palestinians in Gaza are entirely dependent on humanitarian aid, and that comprises food distributions. It includes access to safe water and hygiene materials, and also shelter items. I was there at the start of winter, when the rains, it started raining, and the vast majority of people who are living in tents, which is the majority of Gazans who have had to flee to the middle area at the moment, are living in canvas tents, which are not waterproof, and there's a big need today for plastic sheeting to provide some waterproofing because it's cold. It's cold in Gaza, which is something many people
So can we just nip that propaganda in the bud when Israelis propagandists come and say, Gaza, look at the temperature, 16 degrees. How can you expect Palestinians, babies, to die from frostbite or die from freezing? I mean, it's just ludicrous, because if you're having forced to live in a tent and it's wet, it's winter, even though it's 16 on the day, nighttime for babies, it's probably zero, close to zero. It doesn't have to be zero for a child to die from frostbite. So. So can you just speak to that? And I just think it's such a ridiculous line which has been taken by the pro-Israeli propagandists over the past 2 weeks, saying that, no, this is all myth and this is all lie, and they show the weather forecast for Gaza on that specific day saying it's 16 degrees. I mean, it's just nonsense.
Yeah, it is nonsense. So I can say from personal testimony, having lived there before and also being there in winter at the end of last year, is that it does get cold in Gaza. I was walking around in a puffer jacket the majority of the time I was there, for example, and I wasn't wet. I wasn't waking up in a wet tent in the morning. So it can also be windy in Gaza. So when you put the cold weather, the wet, damp conditions in the tents in which people are living, and the wind chill, it gets cold. And that also, I'm not an expert on this, but I'd imagine that also increases the energy demand as well, and need for calorific intake to compensate for that, which is not there. So winter's a real concern in Gaza, and there are efforts now to try and distribute whatever winterization kits and winter supplies can cross over, but obviously we're talking about a few percentage points against the actual need.
Lastly, Kieran, just before we end, I mean, the report, as I said, paints a devastating picture of the situation in Gaza. And what message do you hope to send to policymakers, leaders of the world and the world community? What do you want them to take away from this specific report, specifically related to the children that are documented in this fantastic report?
I think it's a good question, and I'll admit a feeling of resignation in myself. We shared that, I think, at the beginning, you and I, and it's very easy to fall into the trap of feeling resigned to the ineffectiveness of advocacy efforts up until this point. We mentioned red line after red line being crossed and no meaningful change in the situation. In fact, things projected to get worse this year than they happened last year. I think we cannot allow we need this report to wake policymakers up to the knowledge that this is not normal. It's not okay. We need policymakers to think about their own situation. And, I have two young children. I have a 5 and a 2-year-old. And the idea of having been in Gaza and imagining my children in that situation is unfathomable. I can't begin to even imagine and picture my children in that environment. The reality, which we now can say with certainty and evidence of this being a reality, at 96% of children feel death is imminent, and 49% want to die, should be testimony enough that this needs to end. we need a ceasefire. That's the first priority for every Gazan I spoke to, is we need a ceasefire today. But beyond that, we need political pressure to increase the amount of aid that's actually being permitted to cross into Gaza, and then the aid to be distributed freely within Gaza. I think less than 10% of access requests to the north are denied. So even the aid that is getting in, which is insufficient even for the areas it is today, can't get to the north, which is where the needs are greatest. We also need policymakers to prioritize a long-term investment and commitment to Gaza. When the ceasefire comes one day, that's not the end, that's the beginning. And with an issue such as mental health and how you address acute trauma at a population level, when 96% of children have lived through this conflict feeling death is imminent for them, complex trauma layered by displacement after displacement over family death, personal injury, that's going to take years of recovery, years, decades, you could argue. So we're going to need a mental health system and care structure in Gaza that is supported with long-term funding, with a longer-term view. But none of that can begin until we have an end to the violence, which is obviously the first priority.
Thanks, Kieran. I mean, I want to end on this and on the point of feeling despondent and resignation. I think we've seen Palestinians, as we said before, displaying sumud and resilience. And I think for us who are in this struggle, that we don't really have the luxury. If they can stand up to the devastating bombs and the annihilation, war of annihilation, then we don't really have a luxury and a choice. Our obligation and duties should take priority over our feelings of resignation. We all feel resigned.
Sure.
I think that but the Palestinians are still standing, so we have a duty.
If I could just say one thing quickly, is because this is the thing I was holding on to when I left Gaza at the end of December, is it's not all gone, right? So that resilience is still there, and it's evidenced by when I lived in Gaza, I loved going to Gaza. I loved spending time with my colleagues and friends there, because you just feel like you are the most welcome person in the world. They'll go out of their way to provide everything to make you comfortable, to feel welcome, to feel part of the family. When I went this time, I wasn't sure what to expect. People are desperate. Even our staff, our colleagues, are living in the same situation as everyone around them. And every day they were doing everything they could, despite our protestations, to say, we don't need anything, we're okay, please, prioritize your family. But they'd still come around with falafel, and they'd come around with whatever they had been able to prepare for their family, to share it with us. So that warmth in Gaza is still alive, and that was encouraging, I think, to see. It gave me a bit of motivation.
Encouraging and hopeful. Thank you so much, Kieran. I mean, it's been really fantastic having you on MEMO Conversation and hearing your experience in Gaza. I'm sure our viewers would have loved this conversation, just to hear you speak about the Palestinians in the way you did, giving us, of course, it's sorrowful and hurtful, and there are a sense of resignation. But at the end, what you spoke about is that there is hope, and the Palestinians themselves are hopeful, and we don't really have the luxury of resigning in any shape or form. So thank you so much, and I look forward to having you on the show again. If next time you go to Gaza, come back, can have another conversation. Thank you so much, and thank you at home or wherever you are listening for tuning into this week's conversation with the Middle East Monitor. Bye bye.